From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will comment on the repercussions of that new Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, absent the U.S., on our grain export business. Among the several topics Dan takes up during his weekly segment on the grain market trends, then K-State's Erick DeWolf offers his latest thoughts on the chances for a repeat of the wheat streak mosaic problems that beset the Kansas wheat crop last year, given that the pathogen was just confirmed still further east in the state. And he'll talk about the early prospects of rust diseases returning to impede this year's crop. And later on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more, right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
For his latest observations on the grain markets now, we turn to grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. He's along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas, every Friday right here. To set the tone, Dan, there's really not that much exciting, again, going on in the grain trades. Rather sluggish patterns across the board.
Yes, I think that it is worthwhile to look back at the lows we set in these various futures markets over the past 2 to 4 weeks. In the corn market, about the first 2 weeks of January, we got down to about 345. Here closed yesterday at 355, have shown a reticence to go much lower. And again, so we're past the first of the year into a time frame when we tend to move sideways to maybe moderately higher. You'd have to raise the question as to whether what we've seen now with that 345 back in the early part of this month is the place that will trend sideways to higher from. In the wheat market, that low of about 410 or so on the March contract happened latter part of November, first part of December, and then, of course, we've had dry weather concerns and have absorbed acreage projection that wasn't necessarily friendly to the market, but still have tended to move higher than that level. Again, from 410 back around the 1st of December up to a 435 close yesterday. Even for soybeans, probably especially for soybeans, with the concerns about what's happening for dry conditions down in Argentina, you've got a low of 345 that occurred right after the 1st of January. And from that low, we've really moved sharply higher, I think is probably the way to say it. Or in the current subdued market environment we're in, Eric, to have moved 40, 50, 60 cents, we'll call that sharply, okay? We'll take
right.
that sharply higher up to a close of 992. Some moderately positive news coming into play on these markets on the price side.
Are you saying then that it's safe to declare that the seasonal lows may be in, Dan?
Well, I think we move from now off into February. We're just about there. In some years, you'll see February be a pretty docile time frame in the grain markets. While we're waiting to get to March 1st for wheat dormancy to break. Oftentimes, we have a lot of grain in storage. We kind of have an overhang on the market in terms of potential supplies that could come out if we run up very far. And in most cases, we haven't started field work yet. February's can be pretty discouraging time frames in the grain market. But here, again, we've weathered what we had coming out of the January 12th USDA WASDE and stocks reports, et cetera, and haven't moved lower and have moved our attention actually off into some weather condition-oriented directions, especially watching, again, the drought conditions that are developing in the southwestern U.S. have affected, or at least temporarily affected, parts of Nebraska, Illinois, Indiana, etc., and the need to have moisture come and undo the dry situation that we have. Of course, we have all of February, March, and April for that to happen. But the point is right now it's dry at this time, and those rains will have to come. So for now, we have some support from all of that. So I think we kind of look at the weather issue, and that's providing some underlying support. We have strong use still in our domestic industries. Ethanol production for corn has been going quite strong. Livestock feeding still projected to be up 4, 5, 6% in the beef and in the pork sectors, and 2% or so, I think, in the poultry sector. So that's supportive on the feed use side. Where we're dragging and really could use more positive news would be on the export side. That is really where we're slower in terms of usage. But given strong domestic usage and still a question mark on the export side, we've moved sideways to moderately higher in these markets, and it's sure better than diving off lower at this time.
While we're visiting about current market activity, again, you have been tracking the developments with local basis levels, especially with respect to grain sorghum and the basis strength there. Bring us an update on that, if you would.
We have one or two areas of the state that have extremely strong basis bids for grain sorghum, in particular around the Topeka area. You have a bid on yesterday's closes, a basis of 60 over the March contract in Topeka, 15 over in Concordia. Those compare to corn basis bids of about, for those same communities, about 18 to 35 under. So strong basis bids for grain sorghum. That happens at the same time that we have had, after a run of about 3 or 4 weeks in a row of really good, strong sorghum exports, kind of a slowdown since then. So once you dig back into those numbers, you see that shipments that we have basically through the 11th of January make up about 29% of the USDA's projection of 260 million bushels, but new crop sales make up 72. So there's that gap. It seems indicative of sales to come. And again, the people in our Kansas grain elevator industry aren't foolish people. They would not be offering basis bids like that for grain sorghum if there wasn't some anticipation that there'd be more export business, would be my take on this. So that strong basis bid of 50, 60 over in Topeka and 10 to 20 over in areas not too far from Topeka seems to be indicative of strength to come in the export market for grain sorghum and ongoing support for prices for that commodity.
Comparatively, wheat basis is awfully tepid. In fact, couldn't be much more even keel, you say.
It's amazing how, or amazing is too much of a hyperbole word to use in the grain market. It's interesting how consistent the basis is for wheat across the state of Kansas. At least with what we see being publicly reported. It's basically 50 cents under in the west, in the east, north, and south, with just a little bit of adjustment, 5-10 cents either way. That's even at the terminals, at least as I read the numbers. So interesting to watch how all that works out. Again, there is some variation, but really not any one place that stands out as being really strong for wheat basis bids. When you look at Central Kansas bids, the strongest basis bid was reported actually in Great Bend at 32 under the March, 35 under in Topeka, and again 40 and 50 under in Concordia, Salina, places like that, 70 under in Ark City, Atchison 55 under. And really, and going out to western Kansas, it's just about that same amount plus about 10 to 15 cents in a lot of locations. So I think you're seeing a perpetuation of a situation where we just don't have a lot of exciting wheat export business at this time, and apparently some combination of, I guess, production problems in other parts of the globe, maybe an ongoing trend towards a weaker dollar, if that occurs, can change that situation. But as of right now, we're struggling in the wheat export area, and particularly for hard red winter wheat exports.
Well, back on the trade front, news of the week, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been reforged. It's under another name now, but if memory serves, 11 countries are now part of this new trade agreement. The U.S., of course, is not one of those countries. As you look at that agreement, what are the likely spillover impacts on our U.S. grain trade, Dan?
Well, again, the countries that are involved, as we understand, would be Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. Two of those countries are major export competitors of ours. That would be Australia and Canada. Canada for hard red spring wheat, Australia for white wheats. Of course, then their white wheat can substitute around for some of our other varieties too that we sell. But some ag press reports have talked about the lowering of tariffs that would occur within that group of trading countries. And if reports of 40, 60, 65 cents a bushel are true, and you read these in the press, you have to trust but verify. To the degree that there are tariff reductions for countries inside this TPP group, then U.S. wheat exports to the countries inside that group are at a disadvantage. And who are the major buyers that we see in there? Well, it would be Japan, potentially Mexico, Vietnam at times, and some other countries that may buy. And I don't know if there's a no pass-through part of those agreements, but the lowering of those tariffs that the U.S. would not be a participant in would be a disadvantage. So, again, everything is not finalized. Still a lot of activity going on in the TPP and also outside of that. There's nothing that would say the U.S. couldn't come in and form independent trade agreements with these same countries, et cetera. But at least as this goes forward right now, without any other changes happening, for the major wheat exporters inside that group, Australia and Canada in particular, they would have a export cost advantage over the U.S. going to the major buyers in that group, and one of them in particular would be Japan.
And it just has to ramp up the pressure on the U.S. to craft those bilateral agreements that you just mentioned.
Yes, and it's not our place to get involved in the politics of all this,
right.
But if the U.S. has to compete against countries that have a 65 cent per bushel advantage on us in terms of sending wheat into Japan and into Mexico, that's a problem for the U.S. in terms of export competitiveness on the wheat side.
Dan, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today is back shortly here on the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Well, it won't be long before winter wheat stands break out of dormancy and start developing into productive crops, hopefully. What will likely be the disease pressures that may turn up in the 2018 crop? Get some early ideas on that now from our guest. He's Erick DeWolf, wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Before we look ahead, perhaps we should look back, Eric, at what seemed to be shaping up in our wheat stands as they were planted and hopefully established this past fall.
Yeah, so reflecting back on last year, we had some major problems with wheat streak mosaic and stripe rust as we've gone over multiple times last season and kind of the debriefing of last year. But as we started to get our new wheat crop established, there was a lot of questions again about volunteer wheat and what role does this play in the bridge to establish wheat streak mosaic for a repeat performance potentially. I think some major things were different this growing season from the previous. So I think we had, in many cases, a little later planting for a lot of folks. We also had dry conditions around planting for some folks as well. In some negative sense that can suppress the growth in the fall and make for some spotty stands. Mm-hmm. The positive side of that is even if we have small plants now, we're able to get a decent stand, or at least some stand there, that those smaller plants in the later emergence are probably less likely to be exposed to the wheat curl mites and also the viruses carried by those those particular mites.
So when we think back to last year, as we spoke of the wheat streak mosaic, and let's call it what it was, an epidemic, particularly in western Kansas, that was basically a perfect storm of conditions that came together to create that, and something that's very unlikely to happen a second go-round, it sounds.
Well, we don't know for sure, but yeah, that's certainly the hope is that was an unusual year. The outbreak or epidemic year was hopefully just an unusual thing, and then we'll hopefully revert back to normal. We do often look at this time of year, the fall and the winter months, to try and get a look at some early indicators that we might be headed for trouble for wheat streak mosaic. And if you remember back, we even the fall of last year's crop, of the 2017 crop, we were getting multiple reports, say a couple dozen reports and samples into the diagnostic lab of problems with wheat streak mosaic. So that's an early indicator that we were already headed for trouble. In October and November, we knew we were already in trouble or already had more disease. Mm-hmm. We're not seeing that this year, and I think that, again, puts us back in the par of being more normal now. It's not unusual for us to have a few samples of wheat that are infected with the wheat chromite and the wheat streak mosaic every year, and that's kind of where we're at. We've had a few samples now, but nowhere near the dozens of samples that we had the previous year.
I want to refer back, though, to something that a colleague of yours, Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, shared a couple of days ago here on the broadcast. It was confirmed a few days ago that wheat streak mosaic was present in a field as far east as Dickinson County. So is that suggestive of anything in as far as its progression around the state?
Well, that's an interesting observation, too. And I think, wheat streak mosaic is often, as we just think about a gradient throughout the state, probably least common or quite rare in the eastern third of the state, in the central portion of the state, which, Dickinson's kind of right on that transition from eastern to central Kansas. And so I would say it's sporadic in that area. And then as you move to the further west again, it becomes more common in that area. Within that central area or transition zone that Dickinson County's in, I would say that those sporadic outbreaks are often closely associated with leaving volunteer wheat. So in those kind of areas, environments where we know it can be a problem, it's not uncommon for us in those localized outbreaks to find a source of volunteer wheat, whether it was in double crop beans or other things, that was probably left unmanaged and uncontrolled. And that can tip the scales as well. And
that's the thing to remember, as opposed to other diseases, which we'll talk of in a moment. You have to have that green bridge. In the absence of that, you won't see a fanning out of wheat streak mosaic then. Yeah,
I think that's right. So in many ways, it's a function not only of the environment, but also local management choices that are made. So if growers have done their due diligence of controlling that volunteer wheat, that is the green bridge, as you mentioned, in most situations they should be much better off.
Conversely, the rust diseases need no green bridge, comparatively speaking. They tend to travel on the wind, and we're always looking to the south to see what the early indicators are for the rust pathogens, Eric.
We are, and again, the fall and the winter months are some important times for the wheat crop, but also for these diseases as well. When it comes to these rust diseases, we find that looking to our south, states to our south, particularly Texas and southern Oklahoma, is often where we see these rust diseases over winter. They then increase in those environments or those portions of the country and then are moved by storm systems up to Kansas and points north from here. So there is some possibility that could have survived locally, but in most situations, we need to be looking to our south.
And are there any reports early on from your associates, say in Texas?
So colleagues to my south, to our south, have been largely quiet. I have not heard reports of major problems with stripe rust or leaf rust, so that's good news. Historically, as we look back on some of the more recent outbreaks of, say, stripe rust, it's usually around February and March that we start to get our first reports of major problems for them. So even though our wheat is dormant for the most part as we go through these cycles of cold and warm weather, to our south, their wheat would be more advanced because of their typically warmer temperatures. So by February and March, they're already at more advanced stages in southern Texas where these rust diseases would be progressing. And so they're out making management decisions, and that's what we're picking up on, kind of that radio chatter, if you will, about what's happening and their newsletters and their emails that they're sending out to their growers to let people know what's going on.
Last year, 2017, crop wheat in Kansas, rust pressure anyway.
Mm-hmm. Particularly with leaf rust, I think it was up a little bit. Stripe rust, I think, however, was a little bit more of a problem for us again, and it makes probably 3 years in a row that we've had moderate to high levels of stripe rust. It was kind of the presence of wheat streak mosaic, as we talked about extensively here and in other conversations previously, that was kind of the show stealer. So I think
overshadowed it.
Kind of got overshadowed a little bit, even though I think in the end game there, stripe rust hurt it as much or even a little bit more than what we saw the losses for wheat streak mosaic.
We don't want to lose sight of the rust threat, and that'll be becoming more clear as we move into the next couple of months or so. Just a general thought here, Eric. We do have stands out there that are hurting from things other than disease, primarily extremely dry conditions. And as you look broadly at this, does this stress make wheat more vulnerable to an assortment of diseases potentially?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from my perspective as kind of the disease guy, wheat disease guy here, is that the drought stress or, either excess moisture or lack of moisture at different growth stages can, in fact, predispose wheat to different spectrums of diseases or different spectrums of pest problems. Oftentimes when I'm thinking of drought stress, what we often think of is as those plants become stressed, they often become more vulnerable to some root rot or seedling diseases. So it may not be the outright cold temperatures or the drought themselves, but it's these other fungi that move into these weakened and stressed plants. So in some ways, the diseases kind of jump in, take their share of these already stressed plants and aggravate a problem or already stressed crop stand.
So will we see, if that's happening, signs of that here anytime soon?
Well, I think the key thing for both the viral diseases and then also for maybe some of these seedling or root rot problems is the transition from these overwintering dormant stages to green up. If the crop begins to green up and continues to grow normally, fertility, availability is all in place, and we do get some moisture, that should help the crop recover. And even though plants might have some damage, if they can produce a lot of new roots, they can, in some ways, we might call it even outgrowing some of these disease problems, particularly for the root rots. That same transition time for the viral diseases is important because if we're not seeing the green up and the stand continues to decline, or instead of greening up with the additional fertility, things continue to turn yellow and decline, that's an indication we may have a problem with some of these viral diseases, and the crop's not going to outgrow that. So those kind of rules of thumb there are very different for these different types of diseases.
And to the lay person, it's often hard to separate out what is drought stress, what is disease stress, or what is a combination of the two. So we might just leave folks with this, that the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State stands ready to help with identifying what's going on with a wheat stand if it's looking a little peaked.
Absolutely. That is a great resource that's available to you. I think there's a couple different ways that you can get samples to us. Either you can bring them, ship them directly to the diagnostic lab, or you could bring them into the county office locally. Those individuals can also help you get a sample to the right place.
So you might be thinking in those terms as the crop will eventually break dormancy here in the coming weeks. And if you suspect that there's something going on in your stands disease-wise and want confirmation, the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory can certainly help along that line. Well, Eric, thank you for coming over.
You're welcome.
That's Erick DeWolf. He's a wheat disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today will return after these moments away. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you as we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, yesterday, Canada sought to break the logjam in overhauling the North American Free Trade Agreement by introducing a proposal for more North American content in automobiles. That, according to people following the talks, Canada's informal proposal is in response to a U.S. demand for significant increases in the share of a car and its parts that must be made in one of the three countries party to the deal, also including, of course, Mexico, to be eligible for duty-free trade. The U.S. has said it wants to increase North American car content from the current 62.5% to 85%. The purpose to prevent Asian or other overseas content from expanding in the North American supply chain. This proposal is the latest signal that Canada and Mexico are aiming to show flexibility and engage with U.S. negotiators at the bargaining table. As you know, the president has threatened to withdraw from NAFTA if the three countries don't agree on a major overhaul. Canada hopes that its offer will encourage the U.S. to moderate its demands, according to one official. However, Canada's proposal did not address arguably the most contentious element in the entire NAFTA negotiations, that specifically U.S.-made components make up half of the parts used to build light vehicles in North America to qualify for duty-free movement. Meanwhile, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland met in Davos, Switzerland, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, according to one Canadian official. Significant differences remain, including over how trade disputes among the NAFTA countries are resolved. Also on demands from the U.S. that Canada dismantle its system protecting dairy producers from imports. In Davos, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did tell reporters that he's confident that the NAFTA negotiations can succeed. Competition in global markets is set to become more intense in the coming year for beef production. Global beef production pegged to increase by 1.3 million tons in 2018. This according to Rabobank's latest global beef quarterly report. With the production volumes expected to outpace the domestic consumption, this report says exports will become more critical and will shift the balance of power in favor of importers. The U.S. and Brazil are likely to see the biggest increases in beef exports, according to this report. But it goes on to say the expansion in global production will come out of all major producing areas, including Australia. U.S. beef exports, says the report, expected to increase by 7% in this year as the cattle herd expands for the third consecutive year. That according to Rabobank senior animal proteins analyst Angus Gidley Baird. He said while beef consumption is also expected to increase, it will not keep pace with the production growth, and exports are expected to grow 12% of U.S. production. Gidley Baird said that Brazil is anticipated to increase its export program by 5% in 2018, saying that it's actively assessing new markets and increasing the presence in existing markets, with plans afoot to accredit an additional 11 beef plants to access the Chinese market. If successful, Gidley Baird said Brazil would have 27 beef plants able to access that Chinese market. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue once again is stressing the importance of broadband in transforming rural areas in the 21st century. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
I think it could be one of the most transformative things we do in the 21st century.
That was Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue, who was talking about how important broadband is to improving lives in rural areas.
Not only precision ag, but just really from the education aspect, the entrepreneur e-commerce aspect, healthcare aspect.
He stresses also that times are changing.
We got grandkids, and they go to town, and they play on their cousins' Xboxes and all those kind of things. They come back home, and they're watching the antenna here on getting 3 channels. That's just not going to work any longer.
An interagency task force headed by USDA featured rural broadband prominently in a report that was presented recently to President Trump.
And that was a big issue in the Rural Prosperity Task Force, and gratefully the White House is picking this up.
Meanwhile, one related issue will be coordinating broadband efforts between federal, state, and local governments, as well as with the private sector. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And with this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop now, here's Marcia Boswell.
It's a new year. You've made a resolution to get rid of those few excess holiday pounds. You joined a gym, but you know that it's not just exercise, but diet that also plays a role. Your personal trainer seems like just the person to ask for nutrition advice. But did you know that most personal trainers have little to no nutrition education? That's why the Wheat Foods Council is developing educational materials just for them. Through research, the Wheat Foods Council learned that many personal trainers know less about nutrition and wheat foods than registered dietitians, but give a lot of advice to their clients who share that advice with their friends and family, extending their reach to millions of consumers. Through the Center for Nutrition and Athletics.org, the Wheat Foods Council has put together a panel of nutrition experts to provide personal trainers with the information they seek. The experts include an internationally respected sports nutritionist, weight coach, and nutrition author, a professor of exercise and wellness, a board-certified specialist in sports dietetics, and a world-class triathlete coach and registered dietitian. Michelle Tuttle and Dave Mangan of K&M presented this information at the Wheat Foods Council annual meeting on January 19th in Arizona. Over the past year, the Wheat Foods Council has successfully gotten these expert speakers' presentations accepted by the top 2 major personal trainer organizations' large meetings. Glenn Gaser presented Carbohydrates, Performance, and Weight Loss during an American College of Sports Medicine webinar, which drew the largest audience ever for ACSM. At the ACSM Health and Fitness Summit and Expo 2017, Travis Thomas and Nancy Clark presented twice on Sports Nutrition Guidance for Athletes, Recommendations for What Works. At Idea World 2017, the world's largest personal trainer expo with more than 13,000 personal trainers and fitness professionals, Clark presented Keeping It Real, Sports Nutrition in Action to a sold-out room. Gaser will be presenting at the 2018 Idea World Conference this summer. In addition to the website, Wheat Foods Council has also developed the Food Fit app, where nutrition and athletes meet. This app will allow personal trainers to share science-based nutrition information with their clients. The Wheat Foods Council also sponsored Michelle Tuttle in the World Triathlon Final, where she completed her 4th consecutive top 12 finish of international field competitors. She finished in first place in her age group in the USA Nationals last summer and qualified for Sydney in 2018. Michelle is a spokesperson who knows nutrition and wheat and believes in science-based nutrition recommendations and encourages the consumption of wheat and wheat foods. Her accomplishments and knowledge give Wheat Foods Council tremendous credibility with personal trainers. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and this is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. This Agriculture Today closes out looking at Kansas agricultural weather. Joining us again is Research and Extension climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. And your report this week, Mary, does account for that significant to hefty snowfall, western Kansas in particular benefiting from that, to put it that way.
Well, the areas that saw the greatest snowfall were pretty much confined to extreme western Kansas. Cheyenne and Sherman County had the biggest totals, and they had reports of up to 14 inches in areas there. As you moved east, the amounts dropped off. Still had 8-9 inches as you were moving in towards the Hill City area. By the time you got as far east as Manhattan, we had,
considerably less than that.
Yeah, considerably less than that. We had 2 rounds of it, one in the early morning that melted before anybody could do much more than go out and say, yeah, it's about a half an inch. Then a second round that came in on the backside as the system was leaving the state and brought another inch to our area. So something, at least, but that was not as wet or not as much moisture as we would have liked out of it in the eastern part of the state. western areas where you had that 10 to 14 inches, they saw an inch to as much as an inch 0.71 of liquid equivalent out of that. Again, unfortunately, that band of heaviest snow was fairly limited. The Northwest Division averaged 0.23 of an inch of moisture for that period from the reports that we have at this point. That still was more than double what they would normally expect for the week in that area. So, again, some welcome moisture. The other nice feature from that event is that those snowfall amounts were significant enough that probably packed down some of those fuels. And, of course, there's been a lot of talk on the news about the extreme fire danger that is across much of the southern part of the state, with severe fire danger in much of the rest of the area of the state. So having those fuels compacted a little bit can provide just a tad more relief in that fire situation.
You hint at it there. Southern Kansas, the dryness is quite acute right now.
Exactly. South central Kansas averaged 1/100th of an inch of moisture for the week, which is 3% of their normal. When you look at the January total, they're only running at 1/1800ths of an inch, which is less than a third of what they would typically see in January. January isn't a particularly wet time of the year, but this is coming on the heels of a very dry November and December. In fact, the last significant moisture in that area was in the first week of October. So that's a really long dry period for them. Southwest Kansas, not quite so bad, but still there are areas that have not seen significant moisture since that same October time period. Both of those areas are particularly troublesome from the fire standpoint, since they had ample moisture during the growing season in most locations. There are a few pockets that missed out on it, but still enough so that you had good growth of those pine fuels. So there's a lot of fuel on the ground, and it's very, very dry.
We keep stressing that, but that fire danger out there is nothing to ignore. So please take the proper precautions. And we're becoming accustomed to this now, these dramatic swings in temperatures.
Right. It should be noted that Southwest and South Central divisions had some of the biggest swings. South Central really had the largest. They got up to 83 on the 19th, rebounding from a -5 on the 17th.
2 days earlier.
2 days earlier. And actually it was probably the morning of the 18th that low was actually there. So again, really big temperature swings. And we're not out of the woods on that either. Currently we're looking at a very mild weekend, but there's a front coming through, and Monday we may be lucky to break the freezing mark. Lows will be dropping back into the teens for much of next week, although we will have some highs in the 40s and 50s. If we look at the 8 to 10-day outlook, there is a very strong chance for colder than normal conditions for that period. The 6 to 10-day outlook is for colder. The 8 to 14 is a strong chance for colder. So, again, enjoy it while it's here, but be prepared for the fact that we're likely to have colder weather again.
As moisture goes, this week sounds to be relatively dry, though.
Right. There is a slight chance on Wednesday, but better chance as we move towards the end of next week into the Friday time period. I looked at the quantitative precip forecast, which looks at how much moisture might come from different events. Yesterday, it painted the entire state as 0, less than 1/100th of an inch of moisture. But this morning's quantitative precip has it indicating 1/100th to 1/10th of an inch for all except the southernmost areas of south central Kansas, probably in the Barber County area, where they might not see much of it. But for most of the state, looking at between 1/100th and 1/10th of an inch. And we would hope for the 10th of an inch side of things rather than the 100th. And so that'll be something we'll be watching as we go into next week.
And we want to leave folks with an optimistic mood here, if we might. And you say that there may be a favorable shift ahead in the oceanic activity.
Right. One thing that we watch is the Madden-Julian oscillation. Madden-Julian oscillation tends to change on a 1 to 2 month basis rather than the La Nina, which is a much longer signal. And when it's in certain phases, it tends to be more productive in storm systems, is more active storm development. It looks like it's shifting into that more favorable pattern, which means increased storm systems in the Pacific. The question will be, where do they come on shore in the U.S. and how do they track once they get here? At this point, they're calling for a very active period along the Pacific Northwest. The other wild card, it looks like there may be a ridge developing in the west that would allow those systems to slide down the Rockies and come out from the Four Corners region. As we've alluded to in the past, that Four Corner path tends to bring more moisture into the central plains, whereas those coming ashore on the Pacific Northwest that go zonally may benefit North Dakota, but don't do much good for us here in the southern plains. So we'll be hoping for that pattern shift that would bring those systems down along the Rockies and out into the Four Corners area.
Yeah, we'll hope for that change materializing. We'll see. We thank you, as always, for your input, Mary. We'll talk again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric, and hopefully we'll have some moisture to look forward to next Friday.
That sounds like a winner. Mary Knapp with us, Research and Extension climatologist at K-State. That's been our time for today. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.